Welcome to Global Ethics Review. I'm Alex Wisdom from Carnegie Council, the world's catalyst for ethical action. In this podcast series, we'll be connecting Carnegie Council's work and current events with our senior fellows, senior staff, and friends of our organization. You'll hear from leading experts on artificial intelligence and technology, migration, public health, and U.S. foreign policy and global engagement. This week's podcast is the second in a series on the COVID-19 pandemic and the ethics of global vaccine distribution. In part 1, released at the end of last month, I spoke with Oxford's Professor Cecile Fabre. Currently, in July 2021, some nations like the United States or the United Kingdom are seeing vaccination rates of around 50%, effectively ending the imminent threat of mass hospitalization or death due to COVID-19. Other nations, including many in Latin America and Southern Africa at the time of this recording, are still facing public health emergency. These states simply do not have the same access to vaccine doses. In recent weeks, the Biden administration has put in motion a plan to help distribute tens of millions of doses to some of the neediest nations. Though many have applauded the move, there is less consensus as to whether it goes far enough. Given the existing global inequities, what are the responsibilities of vaccine-rich countries to the rest of the world? What ethical considerations should guide policymakers' thinking on these issues? To help to answer some of these questions and to understand the thinking behind some of the policy choices we're seeing play out, I spoke with Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel. He's Vice Provost for Global Initiatives and the Diane V.S. Levy and Robert M. Levy University Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Emanuel also served on President Biden's COVID-19 Advisory Board during the transition after the 2020 election. One note, Dr. Emanuel mentions COVAX several times in this talk. COVAX is a worldwide initiative aimed at equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. It's directed by Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and the World Health Organization. For more on COVAX, the pandemic, the vaccine, and ethics, you can go to carnegiecouncil.org. You can also find my interview on this topic with Cecile Fabre. I'll be back in the coming weeks with more, but for now, here's my talk with Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel. Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Great. So you and your colleagues have put together something called the Fair Priority for Residence Framework for handling global vaccine distribution. I spoke a couple weeks ago with one of your colleagues, philosopher Cecile Fabre, about this. But for listeners who might not have heard part 1, could you briefly outline for us what this framework is?
Well, we've been trying to ask the question, how do we fairly distribute vaccines for COVID among countries? And how should that distribution happen? And there are really you might say 2 broad components to it. One component is, once you've got some vaccine, how do you pick which countries should get the vaccine and how much? And we call that the fair priority model. And the fair priority model says you should distribute it on the basis of need. And then we go on to analyze, what does medical need mean? And we highlight that first, it should encompass deaths due to COVID, both directly caused by COVID, so if someone dies of COVID, and indirectly because the healthcare system's overwhelmed, people can't get to the hospital, or people stay away with their heart attacks or their births and unfortunately die from that. And then it should consider morbidity related to COVID, but also socioeconomic burdens. Now, obviously, the socioeconomic lockdowns are related to mortality. Once the mortality goes down, the socioeconomic lockdowns tend to ease. So that's one component. Once you've got vaccine, how do you distribute among countries? And basically the idea is need, anticipating which countries the vaccine is going to do the best to limit the number of deaths and socioeconomic dislocation. There's also a question of, when a country has vaccine, when does it have to distribute the vaccine and share it? And that's a question that the fair priority for residence addresses. And it says, at the absolute maximum, you can't argue that we should vaccinate everyone in the country. You might be able to argue that we can vaccinate till we get herd immunity. But there is, the question is there a threshold below herd immunity where you should vaccinate, you should share your vaccine before giving it to your own population? And that's where the this principle of the fair priority to residents goes. Yes, countries should prioritize their residents. We don't have a world government that functions, so national governments have to function and protect their own citizens. But they shouldn't hold on to vaccine below, once they've reduced mortality below a threshold, and that threshold we call the flu-like threshold, which is when does a COVID cease being a pandemic and an emergency, and when does it become background risk? Well, that's kind of like when COVID is like the flu. And, just to give listeners a sense, in the United States, a not bad flu season has somewhere between 36,000 and 60,000 deaths. That's about, 100 deaths to 150 deaths a day. And so that gives you a sense for when. Now, once you've gotten COVID deaths down to that level, a government really is obliged to share the vaccine with other very hard-hit countries. At the moment, those are probably countries like in Latin America, Southern Africa, that are really being very, very hard hit, Mongolia. So does that help?
That's great. Yeah. So you were a member of President Biden's COVID-19 advisory board during the transition. Was the Fair Priority for Resident framework something that you discussed with the president and his team during those months? And if so, were they receptive to this idea?
No, we did not discuss this in particular, but we did discuss the issue of sharing, and certainly we discussed the issue of sharing vaccines once and one of the reasons is, you have to remember, the transition was between mid-November and January 20th, Inauguration Day. We weren't getting any vaccines out. I mean, we were doing a horrible job of distributing vaccines, and the president legitimately set a goal of 100 million doses of vaccines in people in 100 days, and then it became 200 million, which was achieved, round about July 1st. Once you get a big pool of the American public vaccinated, then you can turn your attention to sharing vaccine. But in the transition, we weren't thinking about sharing because we had almost no Americans vaccinated. So the focus was, how do we get shots in arms in the United States? So that was the attention. But as things evolved and as our position evolved, it became, I did advocate, and you can see when the President Biden announced the sharing of vaccines overseas, 500 million doses, part of it went to COVAX, but 25% he reserved to be distributed to hard-hit countries, which is consistent with our fair priority model approach.
Yeah, so I want to talk about where we are today. When Biden announced his plan, or around when Biden announced his plan, was last month, you tweeted that was, I think you said, terrific news and fantastic news. You also had some concerns. So I was hoping you could describe those concerns and maybe and discuss whether maybe some of them have been alleviated in the past month.
Well, so first of all, I think I do think that we were probably a bit slow in sharing vaccine. We had about 60 or 70 million doses sitting at states unused, and we could see that the number of people vaccinated was dropping. We hit the maximum, I think it's April 13th, with 3.34 million Americans vaccinated. And then it's just going down pretty consistently. We're now at about we went down to below 800,000. We're now back at about 1 million a day. We are producing something like 10 million. I haven't checked recently, but something like 10 million doses. We have more than enough to share with the world. And I think we were a little slow in sharing. So that was one concern I had. The second concern, as the fair priority model makes clear, is we should not be distributing it on the basis of population. We should not be distributing vaccine, and I made this argument in the New York Times, saying, look, Ghana on West Africa and Peru in Latin America, two countries, roughly 32 million people. COVAX says, look, they should get the equal amount of vaccine. And Emanuel says, no, more should go to Peru because Peru has 10 times, almost 80 times actually, more cases and deaths than Ghana has. And you should send it to places that are really suffering based upon the need because of COVID, not places that so far have escaped. Now, it's true, Ghana could blow up. Then, we have to look and try to anticipate and send vaccine there. But when we have lots of countries that have high need, they have a stronger claim to vaccines. We don't, I made this analogy, and I think this analogy holds, which is, the emergency room doctor doesn't say, all right, all you 7 people waiting, I'm going to give each of you 5 minutes, regardless of why you came to the emergency, right? It just makes no sense. Someone who's seriously ill and can recover, they get the attention. And the same thing holds in the distribution of vaccines that can save people. It makes no sense to say equal. And I have no idea why COVAX decided that, except for political reasons, not ethical reasons. They wrap themselves in, we're distributing the vaccine for equity, but it's clear that if there is a justification for distributing on the basic population, it's to get as many people to say, look, you'll get some if you join COVAX. That's a political consideration. That's practical. It's not ethical. And ethics, I think, strongly argues against that. And I know that some members of the COVAX facility have argued, we're being idealistic. Well, that's fine, but don't wrap yourselves in, don't justify what you're doing by ethics. Just call it what it is. It's unethical, but we're doing it for pragmatic reasons.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you bring up politics and foreign policy. This is something that we think about a lot about it at Carnegie Council, and I just wonder, when you're advocating for something like this with the Biden administration or any other policy, healthcare policy that you're thinking about, how do you balance foreign policy and politics when it comes to these concerns? Are you just focused on saving the most amount of lives, or does something like some country's human rights record or their relationship with the United States, does that enter into your thinking when you're making these decisions or helping people make these decisions?
Well, distributing COVID vaccines is a kind of soft power, right? And part of what soft power means is you're trying to win the hearts and minds and persuade people that you're doing the right thing, that you're a noble, ethical country, and you're doing good for them in the world. And if you're doing something which is blatantly not good for them in the world, it's going to be hard to win hearts and minds, and actually hard to make this an element of soft power. And so I think you have to have a situation where the ethics goes along with the what's best. And I think our position is both ethical and most effective. And it's funny, I just got off a call with people that I had been having conversations with, and they were saying, we've got to distribute the vaccine equitably and everyone has to get it. Now that Africa got a lot of COVID, you got to send the vaccine to Africa. We should be at the top of the priority list. That's an inconsistent position. The consistent position is we send the vaccine to places that have real need because of their situation with COVID. And that's going to change. Empirically, we've seen, India was nowhere on the map for 15 months and then suddenly had a huge surge. Latin America has had a sort of consistent surge, and that they should get priority. But, when we distributed in PEPFAR, HIV antiretrovirals and all the other things that went along with PEPFAR to combat HIV, we didn't say we're going to distribute them on the, equally among countries. We looked at the most severely affected countries and they got priority. I think and PEPFAR, by the way, was a huge soft power win for the United States. And I think we need to do the same in the COVID situation.
What about countries that might not be set up to distribute the vaccine effectively, that don't have the infrastructure? A country desperately needs the vaccine because its people are dying, but it doesn't have the infrastructure. What do you do in that situation? How do you think about that?
You cannot waste an absolutely scarce resource. There are more than enough people that need vaccine. If a country gets a vaccine and can't distribute it or administer it or doesn't have the cold chain, you have to help them get the cold chain, but you don't send vaccine before they've got the infrastructure. Otherwise, you're just wasting this incredibly valuable resource. And that is unethical. If anything is unethical, if you don't put a shot in an arm and you end up just flushing it down the toilet, that's the worst. It seems to me. No one's benefited by that. And we've seen that happen. South Sudan wasted, couldn't administer some. Other countries have had problems. I think the Congo, it's just unacceptable, unacceptable.
So speaking about soft power, the United States is not the only country that's doing this, that's distributing vaccines. China and Russia have also launched their own efforts. So how do you
failed.
Yeah,
so first of all,
yeah.
The Russians, I had some discussions with the Russians early on when Sputnik was being developed. And I told them, you've got to run a big clinical trial to international standards so that, and then release the data so people have, if you really think your vaccine is going to work, and by the way, there's many good reasons to think their vaccine is certainly as effective as J&J and AstraZeneca, but they obviously didn't. And I haven't studied the issue enough, but they clearly, I linked them up with a very good research organization that could have done the pristine FDA level study, and they failed to do it. That was their mistake. I think just ridiculous. And China, obviously, it's an interesting case where they were poo-pooing the mRNA vaccines and went for a traditional inactivated virus vaccine. It's not clear their vaccine, despite the WHO certification, it's not clear that their vaccine is worth anything, given the situation in Chile, the Seychelles, and other places. If given a choice, I don't know anyone in the world who wouldn't take a Pfizer or Moderna mRNA vaccine ahead of the Chinese vaccine, or a J&J vaccine ahead of the Chinese vaccine. It's unclear that it's efficacious at all. And the Chinese have, they never acknowledge anything, but they did acknowledge that the efficaciousness is not all that it should be. And when you talk to people who are in the know in China, they say, we know that our vaccine effort is 1.0 and Pfizer is version 5.0. We're just not there.
So there's another big player in these conversations. You mentioned a lot of pharmaceutical companies, a lot of drug companies, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, some others. What have you seen from them when it comes to these questions of ethics and when it comes to vaccine distribution? Are they thinking about these questions ethically, or are they more focused on their profit? What's been your impression of the pharmaceutical companies and how they've handled this vaccine distribution?
I'd say that there are pluses and minuses. They are very interested in what we've done. And as a matter of fact, we talked, the group that you're referring to, we talked to Pfizer about their thinking about the distribution and how what we develop might be influential. And I would say, they have wanted, they've been pushing COVAX to distribute the vaccine not on the basis of need. So I know that is a concern. They have other concerns, as you mentioned. One of them is liability. So a major issue in the distribution is they want liability protection, which is not insane request. And I think, it's part of if we had prepared better for a pandemic, the world would have a way of trying to protect, put in a liability protection. So companies wouldn't worry, well, we're going to be taken to the cleaner if something goes wrong in, some country where we either sell at cost or we donate. That doesn't seem fair. They also, I think have negotiated with some middle income countries not fairly and jacked up the price or charge a higher price to them. I can't explain why. It seems to me counterproductive. But that would suggest putting profits above their reputation. So I do know that at least the ethics isn't absent from their discussion. I can't say that it's controlling, but I know that it's not absent from their discussion. And I think what we outlined in the fair priority model had some influence in their thinking. And I know that when they negotiated with COVAX, one of the things that they were concerned about is they did not want to have the vaccines that they were either selling at cost or donating go to rich countries that were part of COVAX. That just didn't seem consistent with their notion of selling at a cost, so that Switzerland or some other country that's part of COVAX that can easily afford a reasonable price. And I don't think the price there, some people are outraged. They're making $15 billion. I'm like scratching my head. Well, they're saving the world. Let's be clear. One, we're all benefiting and you want that vaccine too. Two, the world has lost $20 trillion of economic damage. 15 billion is less than 0.1%. Doesn't that seem like the right payment? I mean, I want them to stay in the game of making vaccines and making them as good as this mRNA vaccine. And if that costs $15 billion across the whole globe, that doesn't seem to me like the wrong kind of price.
Definitely agree with that. So I want to step back a little bit and talk about some of the stuff leading up to where we are today. And, President Trump took a lot of criticism during the pandemic from many different people for how he handled it. But I wonder what your thoughts are about Operation Warp Speed. That was one of his big initiatives. And, we have these vaccines that work. We have high vaccination rate in the United States, and we're in this position where the United States can help distribute millions of vaccine doses. So I'm just wondering how you see Operation Warp Speed. Was there something uniquely Trumpian about it? Would any of president have done the same thing? And did that lead to where we are today with the situation in the United States, where we're able to get close to 70% of our citizens vaccinated?
So in my soon to be released paperback version of Which Country Has the World's Best Healthcare System, I rewrote the coda, which takes a look at COVID and what it says about healthcare systems. And one of the conclusions I draw is that countries that created a command center to manage the whole thing and do it and bring the different groups together did a much better job. Taiwan immediately created a COVID command center. Australia built on something it had. And Warp Speed was kind of like that. Now, the rest of the management of COVID was a total disaster, in part because the president saw how much attention those daily briefings were having and went to the daily briefings and issued contradictory statements and ridiculous statements. But Warp Speed basically took HHS and the Defense Department, the logistics people who knew how to do contracting very rapidly, and the people who knew how to manage research, and put them together with a guy who had a lot of experience. Now, he's been disgraced because of sexual harassment issues, but the actual skill in the management of a process to develop vaccine, understood what you had to do to get the pharmaceutical companies to play the game, because he had been part of the pharmaceutical companies, like the old line about Joe Kennedy at the Securities and Exchange Commission. You put, someone who knows the crooked ways of Wall Street in control of Wall Street, and to regulate it, Anyway, I think Warp Speed was a success. There were multiple bets made, either by research or by advanced purchase commitments, so that people knew if they would get rewarded. And it wasn't a single bet, it was on multiple platforms. And I think that was great. Now, if you look at the other things, we have yet to have a single highly successful study of a therapeutic. Maybe remdesivir, maybe a few of the monoclonals, but it's been awful. And those monoclonals, worst approach to this kind of pandemic, something that is labor intensive to deliver. You can't produce in high quantity. The production competes with the production of the vaccine. It's like, what were you guys thinking when you prioritized this? But, we were nowheresville in terms of clinical research and development of therapeutics. On the other hand, vaccines, very effective, fantastic. And I do think could you speed up the development, the research, development, and manufacturing and emergency use authorization from what we currently have? Maybe you could shave a month off, 6 weeks off, but you're not going to shave much more. It was, I think Tony Fauci used this phrase, a land speed record. It was a record, and it's going to be the model for every future. So development in this area. And so I think, yes, Warp Speed did work, maybe in spite of Trump, but you can't take it away from him that did work.
So a lot of the discussions that we're having around this and that we look at Carnegie Council is nationalism versus cosmopolitanism. Well, was Operation Warp Speed a case of nationalism working? The term has a very bad connotation in Europe, but does nationalism work in the sense in the United States to get us these vaccines?
Look, cosmopolitanism, nationalism are at two poles. And there are, as our fair priority and fair priority for residents says, is there's a middle ground where some prioritizing of your own fellow citizens is legitimate, but you have to remember you're part of a world community and you have to share. And by the way, we criticize people who with ease could save the life of someone else or reduce the suffering of someone else, and they don't do it. And similarly, if we had lots of excess vaccine and we didn't share it with the world, we would be open to criticism. And Warp Speed was a necessary precondition of getting enough vaccine, not just for the US, but for the world, and fine-tuning the production process now to maximize production is critical to helping the world. So it may be part of nationalism that got us going, but it wasn't limited to nationalism. And again, the place we've come out in the fair priority model is in the absence of a world government, in the absence of an effective way for the whole world to come together, this kind of limited nationalism is justifiable. And I think you could say the only way to go in the current world situation. In the non-ideal world, is there an alternative to limited nationalism? I don't think so. Now, the bad kinds of nationalism, America first and screw the rest of the world, we're not part of that community, that everyone who's reasonable repudiates it because it's unethical, totally unethical.
So just a couple more questions. Just I want to focus a bit on your own thinking about the pandemic as we finish the talk. So as someone that's thought about things like vaccine distribution and public health for years, when this pandemic hit over the past year and a half, was there anything that really surprised you, or did it kind of play out how you thought it might?
The thing that has to surprise everyone is the fact that we had technologies that had never been used for vaccines were successfully used for a vaccine, and technologies that had been successfully used for a vaccine didn't prove to be too efficacious. So one lesson that I think is certainly true on the biomedical response side is none of these solutions that we've had, the vaccines, coming up with dexamethasone, none of those occurred de novo. They all occurred within systems where you had pre-existing large investments and ecosystems of, biotech companies, academic researchers, venture capitalists, all of it working already. And so the seed necessary had very fertile ground. That's true for the vaccines. And by the way, in Britain, which has done the best of the clinical research on therapeutics, it was true in Britain on therapeutics. They had a 35-year history of large, simple, randomized trials to get a simple answer fast. And they did a great job. And you can see, they've continued to do some great jobs in terms of mixing and matching of the vaccines and things like that. So I think one of the things this affirms for me is, pre-existing ecosystems are really important to have a rapid response. I already mentioned one of the other lessons, which is making an effective command and control system. I think one of the unfortunate facts is that the COVID pandemic suggested the CDC is not performing as well as it should be. Just immediately prior to the COVID pandemic, somebody, I forget which international body, evaluated public health capacity in different countries, and the US was number one. And if anything was shown by COVID, we're not number one. The CDC had multiple errors, and I'm not sure that they fully acknowledged those errors. They got the COVID test wrong. They sent out the wrong kits. They got all the information about masking wrong, and it took them a long time to actually get it right. And I listened to them. Once I looked at the data myself, it's like, of course, masking works. We've got actually get a lot of data on this, and I came out and urged masking several weeks ahead of the CDC. They got aerosol versus droplet wrong. Their genetic surveillance was bad, and they couldn't coordinate, and still very limited number of too small a number of genetic surveillance sequencing of vaccines to understand which variants are dominant and how fast they're becoming dominant, and finding new variants. So I think the CDC really needs an overhaul. These aren't just a few personnel changes. This is pretty structural. And I think their response was, and it wasn't all political. I mean, I think they were, because of the politics by Trump, the CDC didn't get the criticism it might otherwise have. But I do think that there has to be a lot of serious reorganization at the CDC.
Definitely sounds like a lot there to talk about. So just for the final question, and thank you for your time today, is part of the fair priority, is part of the thinking behind the fair priority for residence framework that this could be used for future pandemics as well? Is this something that can be used when we have new pandemics and new vaccines to distribute? Is that part of the thinking when you put something like this together?
Absolutely. I mean, the reason I put it together is, this pandemic, one of the things that the COVID pandemic has made clear is that the ethics of allocation is central to almost every discussion during the pandemic. Distribution of PPE, distribution of test kits, distribution of other diagnostics. There just wasn't enough for the world, and we had to allocate it. And who better to think about allocation than, frankly, philosophers, public health people, and others. And so I put together basically a group of all-stars from the world, and not just the United States, Canada, Australia, Singapore, Latin America, Africa, and to really think hard about it and to come up with a framework that was both ethically defensible and practical. And we had several people, not just myself, but other people who've done work in global health and with government, so that we understood the practicality and the concerns of policymakers. And so I do think this is a generalizable framework. I think the values we articulated, how we weighed those values, and the framework we came up with is probably generalizable. It's also generalizable in another sense. We made clear data epidemiology matters to how you come to judgments. You know, who's suffering and whether death is the most serious consequence, or whether it's socioeconomic dislocation matters. Being able to anticipate where the vaccine is going to do the most good matters to how you distribute it. And so I think it will have a good longevity and I think influence policy going forward.
Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, thank you so much.
This has been a pleasure. Thank you, Alex.
That was Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, Vice Provost for Global Initiatives at the University of Pennsylvania. For more, including a transcript of this talk, please go to carnegiecouncil.org. Thanks for listening, and stay safe and healthy.